Greetings, my name is Michael Fuller, and this brief presentation is sponsored by Archaeology Now. As a professional archaeologist, I live in St. Louis, but I've done decades of field work in the Middle East, in Europe, and in North America, and I definitely know what it is to be thirsty. I want to talk about the archaeology of thirst. Camels can go 7 months without a drink. But a human will die of thirst in 3 to 4 days, so be careful out there when doing field work. Early humans undoubtedly chose to drink almost always from lakes or springs or rivers, fresh flowing water or still flowing water, but the problem is that water may not taste very good. It could taste fishy, or it could be polluted by people living upstream from where you're drinking. So a much better source of drinking water is freshwater springs, where the water literally erupts out of the bedrock. I can think of numerous archaeological sites in the Middle East that are directly associated with large springs. Jericho, associated with a spring called Ain Sultan. Amman, associated with a spring called Ain Ghazal. And in fact, for 14 field seasons, I worked in Syria at a site called Tel Tunanir, right next to Ain Nuah, the spring of Noah. Springs, though, are perennial sometimes. They go dry during the summer, and they have sometimes low amounts of water during other seasons of the year. Now, 10,000 years ago, people discovered how to domesticate cattle and how to domesticate sheep and goats, and they produce not only meat, they also produce milk. And we had another way of quenching your thirst. But milk, after a few days, curdles or it goes sour. So you have to milk every day if you want to have that as a quenching for your thirst. Now, around 10,000 years ago, people were also discovering fruit juice could be obtained from various fruits. And the king of all fruits for giving juice is the grape. Every grape is basically just a little bag of sugar water waiting to quench your thirst. Interesting thing about grapes is after the juice has been pressed, about 3 or 4 days afterwards, unless you can figure out how to sterilize it and bottle it, it's going to begin to ferment. It's going to begin to change, thanks to yeast, from grape juice into an alcoholic thing called wine. Typically about 10 to 12% alcohol will be the end result. And ancient people learned pretty quickly that not only does wine quench your thirst, it also changes your attitude about life and how things are going. The Romans had many paintings, like one from Pompeii where it shows little puttae, little Cupid-like creatures, who are busily having a party drinking wine. Because wine encourages one to celebrate peace, prosperity, happiness, and leisure. It makes those things even more vivid to you. Now, certain climates, certain soil types will not support grape cultivation. And people figured out how to ferment something else. They figured out how to ferment cereal products, creating what we call beer. And in fact, almost any time beer is being fermented, you'll find special ceramic sieves or you'll find ceramic jars that have been pierced in a process of filtering that product. And here's an example from the Indus Valley civilization, 4,000 years ago in India, of one of these vessels associated with the fermentation of barley, or possibly millet and rice, which were also fermented during that time period in the Indus Valley. Now, my interest in fermentable things comes about as a result of a discovery I made while digging in Syria at the archaeological site of Tel Tunanir. In the background, you can see the Habor River, and in the foreground, you can see a monastery workshop that included 2 crushing basins and 2 fermentation vats for making wine. Now, how do we know all this? We were excavating in the second layer of soil below the surface, called Locust 2, in Square 72, Area 10, 62 centimeters below the surface. Yes, archaeology is very precise. We found a large broken wine jar where a monk had made a list of the types of wine he was producing. He wrote down the types of wine and the quantities in Aramaic, a very ancient Semitic language. And what we could learn was that there was table wine, there was communion wine, usually called wine more precious than gold, And then there was 2 medicinal wines, a wine for the blue disease and a wine for the hacking cough. As we continued to excavate in that area, we actually found the 2 crushing basins where the wine grapes would be stomped, and we found 2 very large fermentation vats where over hundreds of gallons of the juice would be held until they had undergone initial fermentation. In fact, the crushing basin would be quite large, probably at least 3 or 4 men. Some of the monks, maybe some of the men hired by the monastery, would stomp on the grapes with the juice then flowing into the large collection vat. The bottom of each collection vat actually had a trap built into it to catch some of the grape seeds that might have escaped during the stomping process. And as we were cleaning out the trap, we were surprised to find a treasure. Not out of gold, not out of silver, but out of clay. We found a pottery carafe, the vessel that had been used to dip the wine out of that basin, which had broken and been allowed to fall down in the trap and waited for us to find during our last season of excavation. We found not only the wine carafe, we found many of the large wine storage jars. Probably about a week after stomping on the grapes, and while the initial fermentation was going, they would bucket the wine into large pottery jars the size of oil drums. We found over a dozen of these. Each one of those jars was distinctly decorated with patterns of finger swirls. To my mind, that's probably how the ancient winemaker had kept track of either what part of the vineyard the grapes had come from, or what part of the season the grapes had been harvested in, knowing that the later in the season that you harvest the grapes, the higher the sugar content is, meaning the more alcohol the wine could produce, but also the sweeter the wine would be when the fermentation was over. As archaeologists, we photograph these, we make drawings of these, and they all stayed in Syria. And I sadly fear that most of them were destroyed with the destructions in Deir ez-Zor of the museum where I had left them. Now, I told you we found lots of really large jars. That was the wine being served day to day in the monastery and to the guests who came to the monastery. We found a half dozen very small pottery jars, and we came to realize that those are more likely the small jars that held the medicinal wines, wines that had an infusion of various herbs that would then provide some sense of healing and relief to individuals with the hacking cough or the disease that caused the skin to turn blue because of an insufficient amount of oxygen in the blood. So my last picture is of a group of thirsty American archaeologists and thirsty Syrian workmen during the summer of 1994, where we were excavating and uncovering the remains of an early Christian monastery and understanding something about how to create the wine to quench one's thirst. I hope you've enjoyed the lecture.